All right. Well, I want to thank you all for attending our Centering the Margins panel, the Denial of Survivorship, Student Survivors of Color, an HBCU and PWI perspective in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. This event is in partnership with students from Howard University and the Simmons University Multicultural Center. My name is Kenyora Parham. I am the Executive Director of End Rape on Campus, and our mission aims to end campus sexual violence by providing direct support for survivors in their communities, prevention through education, and policy reform on the campus, local, state, and federal levels. Centering the Margins is our framework under which all of our programs and initiatives focus, amplify, and support historically underserved and marginalized student survivors in the campus anti-sexual violence movement. We value our guest speakers who are survivors sharing their stories on the global platform. Reliving trauma isn't our aim, but we know that it happens in this work and because of the space that we're in and that we intentionally create. Therefore, we hope that you will also be able to support our guest speakers for our Sexual Assault Awareness Month by contributing to our gratitude jar. All proceeds will be split equally amongst our guest speakers. And I will drop that into the chat box for those of you who are interested. This is not mandatory, but absolutely something that we will be forever grateful for. For tonight's topic, I am accompanied by two special guests, Kesi Felton, class of 2021 of Howard University, and Livik Inoa, class of 2022 of Simmons University. Before I fully introduce our panelists, I also want to inform you all that this panel is being recorded and it will be made available on our social media platforms. And for those of you who are watching us live on Facebook, I want to apologize to you in advance that we may not always see your questions if at any point you do decide to ask any. And attendees do not have the ability to share their screen or go on video, but you should have the ability to interact with one another and ask questions throughout. And at the end, if we have time, I will be certain to read out the questions to our panelists. In this discussion, I will ask a series of questions to our panelists on their perspectives of student survivors of color who attend historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, and predominantly white institutions, or PWIs. We'll talk about the myths, the stereotypes, and how intersectionality plays a role in how student survivors of color often underserved in this campus space. I also want to share that this conversation is of their perspectives only and is not that of the institutions they attend or the communities in which they are part of as a whole. Because as we know, survivors of sexual assault in their experiences are not monolithic. So I want to remind everyone about that. I also want to provide some trigger warnings ahead of time and that we will be discussing sexual assault, sexual violence as a whole. So please feel free to step away from the screen and give yourself time to process and breathe. And if at any point anyone needs any immediate assistance, I am also dropping some resources in the chat for you all as well. So without further ado, our first panelist is Kesi Felton. She is a journalism major with a sociology minor at Howard University, originally from Metro Atlanta, Georgia, and Kesi's pronouns are she, her, hers. She is the founder of Better to Speak, a social advocacy organization whose mission it is to promote storytelling as a tool for social change. She also works as a digital marketing apprentice at Mixed Communications. She previously served as a communications intern for the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia, communications fellow for Michael Owens for Congress, fellow at the digital marketing agency Bully Bullpit Interactive, director of communications for the Howard University Student Association, and content director for her campus at Howard. From planning and executing social media campaigns to digitally capturing historical moments, her goal is to learn about how to best utilize digital platforms to tell great stories and build real-life communities that last. Welcome, Kesi. Next is Livik Inoa, a third-year student at Simmons University studying computer science and philosophy. Livik's pronouns are they, them, theirs, and they are currently serving as the co-president of Organización Latinoamericana, or Latina Organización, since their first year, and are also involved with the queer POC community at Simmons. Livick hopes to bring in and uplift the voices of queer POC folk who have faced difficult social dynamics and sexual harassment. Welcome, Livick. So, as we begin with these conversations, I just, again, want to say thank you and welcome for being with me tonight. So my first question, and to give some context, over the past 2 administrations, we have seen a rise in the conversation about the need of LGBTQ+ student survivors of color of sexual assault being addressed in the campus context. And despite significant strides in creating safe environments for these students, many are still experiencing harassment and gender-based violence. In one study by the American Association of University Women, 73% of LGBTQ students reported experiencing sexual harassment compared to 61% of non-LGBT survivors. And while, students. And while HBCUs make up nearly 3% of highly education institutions in the US, we have seen studies report that 14.2% of Black women who enroll at an HBCU reported a completed or attempted sexual assault or in a different way. For anyone, or for in a different way, I'd like to share another statistic, in that for every 1 Black woman who reports sexual assault, at least 15 Black women do not. And that's according to the Bureau of Justice for Statistics. So as you all hear that kind of context in some of those statistics, like, what are your initial thoughts? And Livick, I'd love to start with you first.
I think one of my first thoughts is kind of like heartbreaking, especially hearing the LGBTQ statistics, because as a community, we kind of are, stereotyped in that way, where like we are, like there's a constant fear of like being seen as a like predator to others, and kind of like seeing the statistics is kind of like, we want people to report, but at the same time, it's like, in my brain, I'm like, oh gosh, what are other people going to think about us in that sense? And like, it's sad to have to think about that too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kesi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would kind of affirm what Livick was saying. I think particularly about the stats about Black women at HBCUs, I think, and of course, currently as we're having, conversations about, police violence and how Black people interact with the prison industrial complex, I think that kind of connects to the stats about why Black women don't report. I know there are, stereotypes about not wanting to be the reason why, Black men goes to jail, or anybody in the Black community has an interaction with police or, the criminal legal system. And so that, we have to shudder still the harm that we face in spite of not wanting to cause somebody to be put in jail or have to go, through the criminal legal system at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about those stereotypes, right? And, what we have to do with that is we have to go back in history a little bit. And what we know is that sexual violence against women of color in particular is deeply entrenched in US history, from being separated or isolated from families and being sexually assaulted by white men and enslaved Black men, which was really common and legal back then. And historically, what we know is Black women have always been either raped by gangs of white men during the Jim Crow era. And what we know is that the sexual violence has essentially been disproportionately affecting women today on the historical context and within the racism that persists, and that these culturally reinforced stereotypes that have been placed on student survivors and survivors of sexual assault, and especially those who are at the intersection of their identities. In general, when it comes to how society has tried to conclude what is considered real rape, some people think that real rape is the use of force, presence of injuries, and perpetrators who are not intimate partners, friends, or an acquaintance. It's that, stranger who's lurking in the dark way, in the bushes somewhere. And also, one particular study, according to Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Equity study, Girl Interrupted: The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood, And in recent years, Dr. Monique Morris's book, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, really highlights these deeply entrenched racist and patriarchal mischaracterizations, mislabeling, and adultification of Black girls and women. And this includes the three dominant paradigms around Black femininity, like the sapphire and the Jezebel and the mammy. Kesi, I'd love to start with you on this and gain your thoughts on what are some of the other stereotypes that you have heard, particularly in the Black community, where survivors are not being considered to have been seen or believed. And I have another follow-up to that too.
I think I would definitely just kind of like reinforce what you were saying about those statistics, those stereotypes. As you were speaking, I was thinking of something that I read recently where it kind of talked about this idea where like Black women, I think of the mammy, where like that's a stereotype in which a Black woman who is considered a mammy is kind of asexualized and so not really seen as a sexual figure, but then at the same time, like that's kind of used as a, so we're not say that people don't experience like sexual violence because of that stereotype. And so I think it's that conflicting idea where Black women are dehumanized and asexualized and not seen as like autonomous, over our bodies and like agents of our own kind of like pathways and experiences when it comes to our bodies. But then at the same time, we still experience that violence. And I think with all of those stereotypes and all that historical context around sexual violence, I think it compounds survivors' experiences instead of like, what we typically talk about when we talk about these things as far as like victim blaming and all those different things about, what we're wearing. Like that's what Black women face and deal with, women in general, but that's what Black women especially face and deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so again, that only compounds, survivors' experiences in the midst of experiencing that kind of harm.
Absolutely. And, in what ways have you seen students, survivors, other advocates in this work really try to flip that narrative and flip the stereotypes that are being amplified, especially when it comes to the media and entertainment, even in TikTok, how can we flip that narrative so that, student survivors, regardless of the cultures in which they carry, are generally affected by this?
I think one thing, I was reading an article about HBCU, like rape culture, and it was talking about, there was a part that was focusing really heavily on like, it was a study where it focused really heavily on, was the survivor drinking or like whatever, and all these things. I know that's something that comes up a lot when talking about student survivors. And I think with that stereotype in particular, like just reshifting or reframing, okay, we're getting into victim blaming, we're getting into avoiding the actual, the perpetrator of the harm, and not thinking about all these contextual things that when you think about being in college, those are obvious parts of that experience. And so just finding all these little ways to discredit and invalidate survivors' experiences, but just kind of reframing and redirecting what the focus should really be, which is on, the harm that is actually taking place, the perpetrators of that harm.
Absolutely. We definitely need to reframe, reshifts, especially in our own communities, that we come from too, because of the, internalization that we have also endured, that continue to perpetuate, and the things that we either do, the things that we see. And so we have also a lot of unlearning that we need to do in order to really shift that focus, and really amplify those voices, especially for Black women who are disproportionately affected within this space. Livik, I have a few questions for you as well, particularly within the Latinx and Hispanic communities. We know that rape culture has permeated within the community, but that there are notions of high toxic masculinity that has also been normalized. And within these communities, just like in the Black community, speaking out, with regard to what's happening about, especially if it's in the family, in the home, it's prohibited. It's like this code of silence that exists, right? And so sometimes we know that even with that, sexual violence is also encouraged through machismo, right? And the victim or survivor is often focused on and blamed instead of the aggressor themselves. And so, as I mentioned, in the Black community, music, television, internet, the way that we see these types of portrayals of sexual violence, continues to create that cyclical effect. And at the same time, we know that this conversation isn't about the binary either. It also goes deeper than that. And so when we talk about even including LGBTQ survivors, whether they're in the Black community or the Latinx or the Hispanic communities, we also see disproportionate rates of sexual assault, happening and increasing exponentially. And so what are your thoughts on that? What are the stereotypes that you've heard of within your own communities? And then we could talk about what that looks like to flip it.
Yeah, so there's kind of like two sides to this, which is in being a person of color who is also LGBTQ, you have like rejection from your community, and oftentimes that rejection also breeds even more hostility against you, which is where cases of sexual assault may increase, kind of like people thinking that they like, especially like older men thinking that they need to like fix you somehow. And there's the other side of it, which is within the LGBTQ community. And as someone who goes to a predominantly white institution with a high like LGBTQ community, white individuals in the LGBTQ community don't see people of color as like part of the community. And that's something that they don't really address, because when people of color, especially when Black women try to speak up against sexual harassment in the LGBTQ community, like you even have the risk of being called homophobic, or like even if you yourself are also gay, like you aren't really recognized as like LGBTQ as well. Like there's like a constant need to like prove that. So there's like the having to hide it from your community so you don't face harassment there, but also having to prove it so that if you do face harassment within the LGBTQ community, then you can like say like, no, this isn't me making things up. This is me legitimately like speaking from an actual experience. And just like on the machismo thing, like it's also like there is a colorism issue within it, because within the Latin American community, like Latin America is like America in the sense that there is a spectrum. And we also know like that like Black Latinx women face a lot more harassment within the communities than those who like are lighter skinned. In terms of trying to flip the narrative, I know that like within the LGBTQ community, there has been a lot of like movement about just like sharing, like speaking out and like kind of sharing what like love looks like in all colors within the community, not just showing the same like not just showing like the same white androgynous figures over and over again, but actually like attempting to like fight back against that violence with like love and like showing different representations of different couples.
Absolutely. And representation matters across the spectrum, regardless of what shade of color you're in, especially within communities of color. Absolutely. Let's flip it a little bit in terms of talking about costs and financial burdens around this conversation, right? So what we know is, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the CDC has estimated that the cost of rape is estimated to be about $122,461 per victim in their lifetime. And additionally, there's an estimated of 25 million reported adult victims of rape in the US. That's roughly around $3.1 trillion. And amongst those 25 million. So we know that the cost of school is already high for students, as it is, especially if you attend a private university, and especially for students of color who may not have necessarily the financial means to even attend, but are able to attend due to merit and their academic achievements. And so, we have an estimated cost of of rape that students of color may face. So for either of you can start this, but Why do you think the cost is so high? And what are some of the resources that students survivors may have to pay for in order for them to get what they need to either seek the justice that they seek or seek pathways towards healing?
I wasn't sure if Livik was going to go. I think kind of repeating what you were saying as far as like, you know, students who may not come from super wealthy backgrounds. When we talk about race, we talk about all these different intersecting identities and how that can influence the money that you just have at your disposal. Of course, nobody plans for something like that to happen. And so you don't plan for all these expenses. You think about medical fees, legal fees, therapy. You know, if you're working your way through school, the time that you may have to miss at work, you know, because of that trauma. So I would say the cost of just so many different things. It's not just, again, the processes and procedures that you may have to go through, but also like, you know, healing from the trauma of it, and the intersections of like, you know, having insurance and those kinds of things that may compound the cost of that. I know one thing that I thought of was a like Black Survivors Fund. I think a Howard alum started. So things like that, just like community pooled resources, mutual aid that help people kind of pay for those resources I know exist. And can also kind of serve as those pathways of towards healing that you were mentioning.
And I'm so glad you mentioned health insurance too, because that is definitely something that is a hindrance for some students, especially if they don't have parents who have health insurance themselves and can't be on health insurance, as some students would be able to. That I think students have up until the age of 26 to be on their parents' health insurance, but that's not always the case. And I do know some colleges also provide some health insurance opportunities for students too, but I don't think it's necessarily always shown as a resource for students to be able to engage with. Livik, do you have anything you want to add to this?
No, I think Kesi covered everything.
Not a problem, not a problem. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about HBCUs, PWIs. And Kesi, I'm gonna start with you, particularly because you go to an HBCU. And what we know is that like Morehouse, Spelman, Howard tends to be, you know, some of the top HBCU schools that are often highlighted in this conversation around sexual violence. And, you know, there are a lot of students who are looking for administrations to make those changes and do right by their students, especially when it comes to the Black community. But we also know that we don't often hear from other HBCUs that may also be dealing with the same issues that the top HBCUs or those that are seen as the top HBCUs. And so what do you think we can do to help amplify those voices of your fellow HBCU peers who don't really, you know, attend the typically well-known institutions, and that they have a voice too in this space?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question earlier, and I think I definitely want to affirm the fact that like I wouldn't ever want anyone to feel like they don't have a voice. I think when this conversation about like Howard, Spellhouse kind of being the only schools that are mentioned in conversations generally about HBCUs, I think that's just like mainstream knowledge. It's easy to kind of point to a Howard or a Spelman or a Morehouse. And so I think generally it's just, you know, uplifting and constantly uplifting and educating people about HBCUs in general and not just in these instances. But I also think it's kind of incumbent upon people who go to HBCUs to kind of uplift each other. And, you know, when Howard is receiving not just, because I don't want to make it feel like anything is just solely like a HBCU thing or solely a Howard thing, either when we are called out for how the university responds to sexual assault, but like recognizing, okay, when we see, you know, this stuff happening in other schools, like how can we kind of say like, okay, I recognize the experience, although I may not go to that school, I recognize, okay, because it's another HBCU, they can be similar in certain ways. And so how can we stand in solidarity with, you know, student survivors at other HBCUs or organizers who are really working to raise awareness on their campuses, but just generally kind of looking to who's already like on the ground on these HBCUs doing the work and kind of trying to uplift their issues and causes. And just supporting and standing in solidarity however you can.
Absolutely, absolutely. Solidarity counts and matters, especially because we know that HBCUs, some of them are closing down,
Yeah.
other reasons in terms of financial reasons and other matters. And so, you know, I often think about what's going on and what's happening for those students who may have Title IX cases happening, but their school is now shut down. So what does that look like? And we'll talk a little bit about Title IX too. But that's some of which comes to my mind as well when we're talking about HBCUs, and how also HBCUs themselves are not necessarily getting as much funding that is necessary, especially in this space. And so how can we flip that? And the great thing is, what we do know with the current Biden administration, that they're really putting a focus and emphasis on financially supporting HBCUs. So we're starting to see that come about, especially in the most recent years and underneath this administration. Livic, because you attend my alma mater, Simmons University. I know for me, when I attended, I often believe that single sex schools did way much better when it comes to sexual violence, but that couldn't be far from the truth. And I've also learned that there are other folks in this space too that also believe that, but we know that that's just not true. So what is it that people should know when it comes to attending a single sex school versus a co-ed school? Are there any differences? Are there any similarities, just from your perspective?
Yeah, so when it comes to single sex schools, especially like for women and non-binary individuals, like definitely in the classroom, there are a lot of things that are easier, but I think outside of the classroom, there are a lot of and actually, even within the classroom, sometimes there can be complicated social dynamics with like classmates and professors as well. I think like people also tend to think that going to a same-sex school like means that you'll never ever like get to see like anybody else, and that's like also not true. A lot of the cases that like that we get warned about when it comes to sexual assault is because people go out to networking events or they go out to like parties and they like kind of think like, oh well, I go to this school, if I go to this school like just for one night it'll be fine, but things like can still go wrong. And like being in an institution that is same sex doesn't necessarily protect you when you're outside of it. Um, Also, like for me at least, it being a predominantly white institution and like dealing with, I guess, like white perpetrators is also a very big deal, because a lot of the times, like things that would be sexual harassment if I did them are passed off as like just like innocent acts, or like my peers joking around, or like it's all kind of like made to be in a more innocent light, especially because it is white women. So a lot of it is like, oh, this is just like an innocent little action, just like a little joke, or oh, this person is just like just really likes you or is just into you. Meanwhile, it is actually like borderline like sexual, not even borderline, it's pretty much like harassment and like things that are very like uncomfortable to deal with. But and because of like the constant like messages, it doesn't necessarily feel like you don't feel like you should be making as big of a deal about it. But definitely like single sex schools do have issues with sexual harassment, and in my opinion, I think they're more difficult to report, because the main definition of rape that we have in the United States, and like I think globally, like people think it has to be like a cis male, cis heterosexual male and a cis heterosexual female, when we know that is not the case. And we know that like especially like trans people of color face a lot of like these a lot of like harassment, even from like these these like men who claim to be like cis and heterosexual. Like they will just do so much violence and then like write it off as like as if it was justified. And definitely like those are things that you have to watch out for anywhere, no matter what kind of institution you go to. But I also don't want to make people feel like it's like entirely dangerous.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's definitely, I would say like pros and cons for sure of attending a single sex school. And I also want to name that Simmons, I believe, no longer refers to itself as a single sex, but more so women-centered university.
Yes, I was thinking of mentioning it.
Yeah, and especially because of the fact that now it's a university and it has colleges that are co-ed. It's giving, you know, folks that space to recognize that they too can be a part of the Simmons community. But I think it's so right. You're so right, right? Like there's these kind of underlying tones and comments that are being made, implicit bias, explicit bias, folks who are coming in with their own cultural understanding or what they think is their cultural understanding. And also some folks who are coming in to, especially when we're talking about a predominantly white institution and a women-centered institution, you know, I know in my experience when I was at Simmons, I've known folks who have never experienced even being surrounded by other folks of color, and all of what they've ever received and known about is through media, through TV, and through movies. And so when you think about, you know, those types of myths and stereotypes that are portrayed in that way, and then you are coming into this women-centered institution, and this is not just to Simmons, I believe this expands all the way across from Spelman to Wellesley, and I say Spelman, knowing that it's a predominantly Black institution for women and at the intersection of their identities. There's also issues that also are within the Black community too. But, you know, just this idea that people are coming off, you know, just thinking, you know, oh, I'm going to say this thing out loud, not realizing like the repercussions to what they're saying. And then we're also talking about the fact that people believe that it is around cisgender male and cisgender females. There's a lot, like Simmons is the only women's college that is like almost centered in like Boston College Mecca of other universities that are surrounded by, that are, you know, have students who are co-ed, who identify of different things in terms of their intersectional identities. But at the same time, people also forget that sexual assault can also occur between folks of the same gender identity. And so we have to give way, we have to pay attention to what that looks like. And, you know, recognizing that, yeah, there may be some pros towards going to a women-centered single sex, you know, institution in terms of not getting objectified, you know, by that male gaze. But there's also other folks who may be at the same, you know, same identity as another, who may portray those same kind of sexist and patriarchal types of ideas.
Yeah, and I will add, like, even if you're not technically objectified by the male gaze, like if you are a student of color and like within the LGBTQ community, there is like this weird, like underlying, I guess, like dynamic where it's like people of color aren't perceived as desirable when it comes to romantic relationships, but very much so when it comes to sexual relationships. And that's something that like it permeates society to the point of like permeating the LGBTQ community. However, with the LGBTQ community, many people hide behind that identity in an attempt to avoid accountability for, you know, their own like racist stereotypes. So that's something that like is very difficult to like call out to, because as I mentioned earlier, people of color aren't really seen as part of the community. So you risk like having to like it takes a lot out of you to like have to first affirm your identity and then like have to call this thing out in somebody else.
Absolutely. It's like a double, triple standard. You know, you're already, you know, dehumanized and vilified for being a person of color. And then if you top on another layer of your identity, you just further sink into this, like, you know, this ideal that, you know, folks don't really see you as who you should be and as who you are. And Charlotte, thank you. Yes, the fetishness of the exotic, that's exactly right. the hypersexuality, especially within communities of color, especially for women, and folks within the LGBTQ communities that are often, fetishized and portrayed in certain lights in order to continue the negative portrayal of them. Absolutely. So I'm going to shift over a little bit to now Title IX, which we referenced earlier. So for those of you who are on the call, last month, President Biden signed an executive order on Title IX last week, the Department of Education announced their launch of reviewing Title IX, including hosting a public hearing, providing questions and answers document for clarification on schools to really understand what their obligations are under Title IX, and the formal process of the notice for proposed rulemaking under the Federal Registrar, which is also called the NPRM. For any of you who are trying to figure out like what's Title IX, what is that, I encourage you to watch our virtual Title IX town hall that we had yesterday in partnership with It's On Us. You can find that on our Facebook Live as well, or even on our Instagram pages, which I'll be sure to share with you on our chat. But I have questions particularly for Livik and Kesi, because I know when I was at Simmons, even when I went to BU for my master's, like Title IX was not something that I necessarily heard of. And I felt like, if anything, when I did hear about it, it was always centered around sports and athletics and, the equal opportunity for women to be a part of male-dominated sports teams. And so I'd love to know from you both, like, when was the first time you became aware of Title IX? Are you still, learning more about it? And yeah, I want to start there. When did you first learn?
I think for me, I want to say like freshman year, they had like a mandatory training or mandatory like orientation that we have to go through, where we meet our Title IX director and the Interpersonal Violence and Protection and Prevention Office director, and they go over, Title IX and consent and, enthusiastic yes, those are things that are really common at Howard, I know. So yeah, I would say freshman year, and then sophomore year, actually, I was introduced to EROC, and we did like training, and that's when I became more aware of like the policy aspect of Title IX. And so I would say like around my like freshman or sophomore years when I really understood like what it was and what it covered.
And would you say that was consistent? Like, you had it through orientation, but then did you hear about it on a consistent basis, or only when certain things arise?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's the latter. I think they've done a little better. Howard's done a little bit better as far as like keeping the conversation going throughout the school year, and not just during like the red zones, like, at the beginning of the school year, around homecoming, times when, it's more relevant to talk about it. But yeah, I would definitely say that freshman orientation was kind of like the one and done kind of conversation, where we learned about, of course, like sexual assault was something that people like knew about or maybe experienced before coming to Howard. But as far as like the Title IX policy, procedure, the office, what it does, I think that was kind of like a one and done kind of thing during freshman year.
Absolutely. And Livik, how about you?
Yeah, similar to Kesi, Title IX was mostly something that was talked about in orientation, but I know like Simmons has like a violent prevention and education office, which I think they have more resources on it for people to like talk about. And I know that they frequently also have like meetings, or like some of their programming maybe like has been centered in the past about Title IX, or just like, like tips in general on like what to do. But for orientation, it was mostly talked about in the sense of like partying, and like that's strictly how they very strategically, I don't know if it's on purpose, but it's placed as like an off-campus thing, like not necessarily something that it's like, if this happens to you on this campus, it's more like if you leave campus and this happens, you are still protected, and kind of in that way.
I will say that the one good thing about the current Title IX regulations is that it includes on and off campus sexual assault. Everything else about it needs to be overhauled. It's definitely rolled back protections for students and student survivors. And, I'm just glad that the department is actually moving forward with reviewing what the Title IX regulations look like. And, hopefully we can really see some progress in there, which brings me to my next question. Given that, we're under this, idea, this theme of centering the margins, when you think about CTM, what is it that you would want to say to the Department of Education when it comes to putting consideration into their review process, especially when they open it up to the public, who are able to share either their testimonies or ways that they think, that certain voices need to be uplifted, especially when we think about students of color who are at the intersections of other identities, who are often left out of this conversation. What are some things that you think the Department of Education should really put into consideration when it comes to, really ensuring that historically marginalized students are really seen, believed, and heard?
I would say just like you were saying, just being intentional about including the voices of people who are most on the margins, and not looking to you think about, and I even struggle with this because I sit on the Title IX advisory, student advisory committee at Howard, and their minds immediately go to the most popular organizations, the most known, students and organizations, rather than, okay, who are students who may not necessarily be, involved, or may not be the most well-funded organization, for thinking more broadly, the most known national organizations. So just being intentional about tapping into organizations who are really on the ground, organizers who are on the ground and most intimately connected to the communities who are most on the margins, I think I would say first. And then also knowing just the limits of a Title IX policy. I think that as we continue to review and clarify and refine the policy, I don't think that it will be entirely sufficient whatever they come up with. So just again, trying to include as many voices as you can, and trying to get it as close to, being something that will actually support survivors in the ways that we actually need, and also understanding the larger kind of social context and implications and factors that kind of play into, why we even have to deal with this in the first place. So I would say that just being really inclusive about the voices that you bring to the table for their input, and then also just recognizing the limits and the layers to the issue that we're trying to address.
Absolutely.
Adding on to that, I think something that would also help them would be I guess shedding preconceived notions of sexual assaults and what that looks like, and again just the very just the definition of what people think real rape is, that even with how much I guess the government has tried, it still very much permeates in government, it permeates in courtrooms, just that doubt. So I think I don't want to say having to write a clean slate, because there has been good work done, but in a sense kind of shedding past notions when coming up with new ideas.
Absolutely. It's this idea of centering the margins and centering the voices of students of color, those who are also at the intersections of other identities, and really putting forth a policy that is survivor-centered, intersectional, and trauma-informed. I think you both have definitely hit the nail on the head with that. For those of you who are with us, I am about to ask my final question to the panel, but if there are any questions that you do have, please feel free to provide them in the chat, especially if there are things that we haven't covered and you're wondering about certain things. Definitely will be open to asking your question on your behalf. So my final question would be, what are some words of advice that you can share with any of your fellow student peers who may be on this call, survivors who are on this call, maybe even some administrators, campus administrators who might be on this call?
I think it touches on even the last question, when we are thinking about solutions to this problem. I think one thing that has frustrated me a lot in dealing with Howard as an institution, the administration over the past couple of years of my being there and working around sexual assault awareness, is just the inability to like hold space to acknowledge the harm that either has been caused, not directly, because I think sometimes when we think about like silencing survivors, when we think about just not fully supporting survivors or doing things that show that they are more committed to protecting perpetrators or protecting the image of the university, and just not just being honest about that harm, whether or not it was intentional or not, I think gets in the way of being able to like fully address a lot of, or like to even like comprehensively come up with solutions that will be adequate and sufficient and survivor centered, instead of like trying to not listen, trying to not fully be held accountable for just like the gaps that may have existed that didn't allow, that allowed certain things to happen, or, kind of made someone's experience worse or whatever. I think that in particular has always been one thing that has made students feel like, Howard has been in the news a lot, in the past couple of years about this in particular. And I think that they being the administration, like really don't like when we talk about it on social media, when it's in the news, like going back to the idea of the image thing. But it just, again, shows that like, okay, what is the goal there? Is it to protect students and survivors, or is it to protect the university and the image, and like what, who really wins in that situation? So again, just really supporting students and really being survivor centered for administration and students as well, is just like doing that work to really understand how to be a better ally, how to be a better supporter, how to advocate for people alongside people, how to find ways to support people like materially and tangibly. Because I think that there's so much and it's so nuanced that we are trying to like work and achieve within 4 years of being there, or however many years that you're in college, and if you remain connected to your school afterwards, like there's just so much that goes into it. And I think that trying to like protect yourself, or trying to protect, institutions, or trying to protect whoever, like it's not going to, like, people, there are real human beings that have to deal with the ramifications of like, that not being people and survivor centers. So I would just say like, believe survivors, focus on supporting survivors. That's really what it comes down to.
Go ahead, Livy. Yeah, sorry.
My advice will probably like come out of left field, but I just feel like it's really relevant, especially considering like quarantine and things like that. One of the things that I would say is like, try to keep an eye out online as well. Like, harassment is not just an in-person thing. And like, especially like, if you have siblings or something that are underage, or if, you're a parent, or like, even if you're not underage and even if you're not a parent, like these things can happen over the internet. And like, I know that very well, like it can definitely happen. Grooming really can happen, like even after, you hit like, even after you hit like over 18, like that's something that is still like, we have to keep an eye out. And even if like, and especially with cases like grooming, even if it's not like you being the victim, sometimes the perpetrators could be right around you and you don't know it, because they'll be like, it is like, it'll be like something brought up casually in a conversation. So in that case, like keeping an eye out, like with your friends, making sure that like, I guess like, and like calling out the behaviors of like people who seem to be like having inappropriate conversations with people they shouldn't be talking to on the internet. And like with Zoom, especially, just like the boundaries and the lines between like professionalism and like friendship and things like that, all of that has been blurred recently. And just like keeping an eye out for that, and definitely being careful and intentional about how you proceed around those situations, especially if you notice someone that like crossing the line.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for sharing that advice. One question we do have in our Q&A is, are there any differences in how your universities process bias incidences versus Title IX incidences?
I think for bias incidences, from what I've heard, I've actually had more experience hearing about bias incidences than Title IX incidences, which I think kind of like, I don't know, it kind of speaks to like priorities in that sense, because when it comes to Title IX, a lot of things are kept like very much quiet under wraps, but like when it comes to Title IX incidences, not Title, did I say that backwards? I did say that backwards. When it comes to Title IX incidences, I like a lot of the things are kept under wraps. So when it comes to bias incidences, I think within the community, it's usually like brought up by someone, or like, you know, people like especially like students of color at Simmons will very much like be like, okay, they're handling me this way, this way, this way, this way, like keeping that documentation and like telling their peers. Whereas for Title IX incidences, I haven't really like seen or heard much about them. But in a way they are kept similar. They're like, in a way they are kind of similar. Definitely there's always like this weird thing where like, even if you know like who perpetrators are, you really don't like see or hear much, I guess, like accountability, if that makes sense. Like the punishments are usually like never revealed as much. And I like, even and even if they are, like usually it's something like very light. Like Simmons particularly isn't like really big on like huge like punishments against like students who break code or break rules.
Mhm, mhm. It's interesting you mentioned that, 'cause as you were talking, I was thinking about when I was an undergrad at Simmons, we actually would get reports of, especially when you're walking from the residential hall to the main campus, you know, pre-COVID, 10 years ago, and you're going from one point to the next on the campus, we would actually get reports from the campus safety office, I believe, you know, just like letting us know, hey, make sure you know, take extra caution. There was, you know, someone whose bag was stolen from them while they were walking from point A to point B, or someone who was sexually assaulted. You know, we would get those type of incident reporting that didn't necessarily have to do with what was happening on campus or between students or faculty or anything like that. But you're absolutely correct in terms of more bias incidences occurring, especially when it comes to students of color and Black students and Latinx students, especially because of the history at Simmons. And as president of the African American Alumni Association of Simmons, I can definitely attest to that, and former BSO president. So absolutely, absolutely. So I want to thank you both for being on this panel. Kesi, if there was anything you wanted to add to anything, I don't want to stop you before I just transition us out. Oh, we may have one more question too.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Do your universities have a sexual violence survivors group or organization that you can access? If not, if there was a group or organization, would you feel comfortable joining or participating? Or maybe even creating?
I think for me, since I'm a senior, like thinking about, you know, how do I fit into this work post grad, I think I would say like the Title IX Student Advisory Committee is one. I know I and some other students like years ago started an organization on Howard's campus called Safe Spaces that was specifically dedicated to address sexual assault on our campus, but we kind of dissolved after a while. But as far as like, you know, I would definitely be interested in, you know, joining one and continuing that work and specifically remaining connected to that advocacy work at Howard. So I think yeah, kind of creating that work for people post grad even, I think is also super important.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Within Simmons, we have the Violence Prevention and Education Office, and they kind of like run in a way almost as if they're their own organization. And I would honestly feel super comfortable going to them. But also I know that the individual orgs, like individual affinity organizations, they have their own meetings on sexual assault. And events like surrounding like, you know, safety and things like that. So even if you're like, if you don't feel comfortable going to the office, you can also talk to your own organization. Me personally, I think for next year, since that's going to be my last year, I do have a personal like goal in mind, and like kind of integrating like all queer students on campus, because currently there's no initiative really to like have like a queer organization for students of color. And I think that's something that like I want to work on, and then, you know, address these issues and just address the inequities, and like do it in a way that like builds community rather than like, you know, more hostility against the groups.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, as we close out, I just want to say thank you to each of you for just sharing your insights and your perspectives, especially as students who attend two different types of institutions, but are, you know, essentially seeing very similar things that are happening on your campus. And so I just want to thank you both for sharing your insights with us. And for those of you who are watching, just know that this is just the beginning of conversations, especially under our Centering the Margins framework. And that for anyone who is watching and is currently dealing with a Title IX investigation and is looking for support, especially from some legal support, I'm going to drop a few of those resources in the chat as well, two of which we partner with, and we'll actually be, I'll be moderating another conversation tomorrow with the Equal Rights Advocates and the National Women's Law Center, and they'll be discussing ways, legal support options, and also talking about some real life scenarios of Title IX cases and what particular alternative options student survivors will have in order to navigate through those processes. And if anyone is, you know, not looking for legal support, or is just like trying to figure out where can I share my story in some way, and do it anonymously and not have to, you know, worry about who may know me, we have launched a new platform in partnership with It's On Us called Survivor Spaces, which I'll also add into the chat here. And for those of you on our Facebook, we'll be following up via email, and you can also see some of these resources already on Facebook or Instagram or even our Twitter page. But Survivors Spaces is really a platform where you can share your story anonymously, and you have full control of your story. So, you know, you could share it one day and then decide, I want to take it down the next. Because we know that survivors may not be ready to share their story, and that's perfectly okay. But we wanted to make sure that they have a space where they can be in community with other survivors. You don't have to be a student. You could be a professional, seasoned, person, and really utilize this space to your advantage, and being in a space that also really focuses and encompasses healing, community, and hope. So if that is you, please feel free to utilize our platform and share your story there. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about EROC, how you can get involved, I definitely encourage you to check out our website at endrapeoncampus.org. And absolutely, I just again want to thank you both for this. This was such an amazing conversation, and I'm so glad that we were able to hear from both of you. So to everyone, please take care of yourselves, enjoy the rest of your week, have a good weekend, and stay blessed.